The first officer stepped into the room and froze. The house was silent, unnervingly so, but what lay before him screamed louder than any sound ever could. A woman lay motionless on the living room floor, her hand stretched toward the hallway, as though she had tried, desperately, to crawl away. Her eyes were half open, glassy, locked in that eerie stillness that speaks of a life stolen too soon. Around her were fragments of a life that should have been ordinary: a coffee cup, a pair of slippers kicked aside, the faint trace of a struggle etched into the rug. It was not just death he was staring at, but the aftermath of something vicious, something deliberate. For the neighbors outside, the flashing red and blue lights were the first signal that their quiet street was about to become infamous. Behind those curtains, hidden from their view, detectives were already piecing together a crime scene that would haunt them for months to come. But before the story of blood, betrayal, and secrets unraveled, there had been a woman with a life, a woman who never knew that her every choice, every relationship, was quietly setting the stage for the night her world would come crashing down. She was the kind of woman people noticed not because she demanded attention, but because her presence carried a warmth that drew others in. Friends described her as vibrant, always ready with a laugh that could soften even the most serious of conversations. She loved her family deeply, worked hard at her job, and held dreams of a future that felt solid, secure. Yet even the brightest smiles can mask shadows, and hers concealed more than most people realized. From the outside, her life looked enviable. A stable career, a supportive circle of friends, and a partner who seemed to adore her. They had met years before, in one of those chance encounters that turns into a story people tell at dinner parties. At first, everything had been picture perfect, the kind of love others admired. But behind closed doors, the cracks began to form. Small arguments that escalated too quickly, jealous glances that lingered too long, words that cut deeper than they should. Friends noticed changes in her, subtle at first. She grew quieter, more hesitant when talking about her relationship. Sometimes she made excuses for why she couldn't meet up, or why she seemed distracted when she did. One close friend remembered a phone call late at night, her voice trembling as she whispered, "I don't know what to do anymore." It was brushed aside then, chalked up to stress or a rough patch things every couple goes through. But those words now echo with chilling clarity, a warning unheeded. The days leading up to her death were ordinary in every visible way. She went to work, ran errands, texted friends about weekend plans. Yet behind those texts were pauses, unspoken hesitations, the weight of something unshared. She had confided to one person that she was thinking of making a change, of walking away from the life she had built with him. It was not a decision made lightly, but one born from years of silent battles and hidden bruises, emotional and otherwise. The night everything ended began like any other. The television flickered in the background. The hum of suburban life carried on outside, and the world kept turning, oblivious to the storm brewing inside that house. What happened next was fast, brutal, and irreversible. By the time the neighbors noticed the unusual silence the next morning, it was already too late. When police entered, the clues told a story without words. The overturned chair, the shattered glass, the faint imprint of a hand pressed against the wall. It spoke of fear, of resistance, of someone fighting desperately for her life. And yet, it was also a story of inevitability, because whoever had been in that house with her wasn't a stranger. This was no random act of violence. Detectives knew it almost immediately. This was personal. the kind of crime fueled not by chance, but by rage, jealousy, and betrayal. Outside, neighbors huddled together, whispering fragments of speculation. Some spoke of late-night arguments they'd overheard, muffled but unmistakable through the thin walls of suburban houses. Others recalled moments when they had seen her looking distressed, brushing it off with a forced smile. The truth was, everyone had seen small glimpses, tiny warnings, but no one had ever pieced them together until it was too late. Her family arrived at the scene in disbelief. Shock turned into grief, and grief into the kind of anger that doesn't fade quickly. How could this happen here, in a place where she should have felt safe? The detectives promised answers, but they also knew that the hardest part of their job was just beginning, because behind every scene like this is a tangled web of relationships, motives, and lies. And somewhere, out there, was someone who knew exactly what had happened and why. The investigation was only in its infancy, but already, suspicions began to form. Who was the last person to see her alive? What had been said in those final, harrowing moments when her voice was silenced forever? And what could drive someone who once claimed to love her to such a brutal act? The answers, as it turned out, were buried in years of history, in the small moments no one had paid attention to at the time. They would emerge slowly, painfully, as detectives pulled at every thread of her life. But one detail from the very beginning of the case stood out: a mistake the killer had made almost immediately. A mistake so small it was nearly overlooked, yet one that would later become the crack through which the entire truth came pouring out. Could it be that the first clue to the killer's identity has been there all along, lurking in plain sight, waiting for someone to connect the dots? There's so much more to this story that will take your breath away. If you find it worth listening to, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next installment. Long before that horrific night, the story had already been unfolding in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. Her friends would later recall small moments that, at the time, didn't seem alarming. A glance that lingered too long, a question repeated too often, a mood that shifted without warning. All of it pointed to a tension brewing beneath the surface, one that would eventually consume her life. She had met him when she was younger, at an age when love feels intoxicating, unstoppable. He was charming in the way that draws people in quickly, attentive, flattering, someone who made her feel like she was the center of his world. At first, their relationship seemed almost too perfect. He knew how to say the right things, how to make her laugh, how to make her believe that she had found someone who would never let her down. And in those early days, she believed him. But slowly, the charm began to crack. His protectiveness blurred into control. His compliments came with conditions. A night out with friends was met with suspicion, a delay in answering a text with accusations. At first, she brushed it off. Isn't this what love is supposed to be? Messy, passionate, demanding? But deep down, she began to feel the creeping weight of isolation. Friends noticed. She stopped joining group outings as often. Her laughter, once effortless, seemed more rehearsed. A colleague remembered walking into the break room one day to find her staring blankly at her phone, her smile fading as she typed. "Is everything okay?" the colleague asked. She quickly nodded, muttered something about being fine, and changed the subject. Behind the curtain of her private life, arguments grew sharper. He became suspicious of her every move. She found herself carefully choosing her words, calculating how to avoid conflict. Even moments that should have been joyful were tainted by his need for control. When she spent time with family, he would call repeatedly. When she planned something for herself, he questioned her motives. There were good days. Of course, that was part of the trap. Days when he was affectionate. When he seemed like the man she had fallen in love with. Days when he promised change, when he swore things would be different. Those glimpses of tenderness kept her hoping, kept her believing that maybe, just maybe, the relationship could be saved. But with each passing year, the good days grew fewer, and the darkness took up more space. By the time she began confiding in a close friend, she was already exhausted. "I don't recognize him anymore," she admitted one evening over coffee, her voice trembling. "It's like I'm walking on eggshells all the time." The friend urged her to leave, to put her safety first, but she hesitated. Love, especially when it is tangled with years of history, has a way of binding people, even when the logic of escape is clear. And then came the secret she had been holding close. She was planning to leave him. Quietly, she had been considering her options, thinking about moving out, even reaching out to a relative about a possible place to stay. It was a decision that terrified her, not because she doubted it was the right thing to do, but because she knew exactly how he would react. He had told her before, in a tone that left no room for misinterpretation. "If you ever leave me, you'll regret it." Those words would later echo in the minds of detectives as they pieced together her final days. Because deciding to leave wasn't just about ending a relationship, it was about igniting the very rage that had been simmering in him for years. On the surface, life carried on. She went to work, visited family, shared smiles with friends. But the closer she got to taking that step toward freedom, the more dangerous her world became. He noticed the distance, the subtle ways she was pulling away. His questions became sharper, his temper shorter. There were moments when she thought about calling the police, about confiding in her family fully, but she always stopped short. Maybe she still believed she could manage it, or maybe the fear of his retaliation kept her silent. In hindsight, everyone who loved her wished they had pushed harder, asked more questions, refused to accept her reassurances. But at the time, they believed her when she said she was okay. And then came the night. The last night. Detectives would later piece together that an argument had erupted loud enough that the neighbors might have heard muffled shouting through the walls. She had stood her ground more firmly than usual, unwilling to back down this time. She wanted out, and she wasn't going to be swayed. For someone who thrived on control, those words were unforgivable. What followed was chaos, furniture shoved aside, glass shattering, her desperate attempt to break free. It was not just a fight. It was the culmination of years of fear, silence, and desperation. And it ended in the most brutal way possible. The tragedy of her story lies not just in her death, but in the countless chances for intervention that went unrecognized. The late-night phone calls, the forced smiles, the whispered admissions that she was afraid. All of them were fragments of a bigger picture. A warning that no one fully understood until it was too late. Now, as detectives dug deeper, they faced the hardest question of all. How do you find justice for someone whose cries for help were heard, but not acted upon? Could her death have been prevented if someone, anyone, had intervened sooner, or was she always destined to be the victim of the man who wouldn't let her go? The story takes a darker turn from here, with revelations that will shock even the detectives investigating the case. If you want to know what happens next, subscribe so you don't miss the next installment. The crime scene was suffocating in its silence. Officers moved cautiously through the apartment, their gloves brushing against overturned furniture, broken glass, and the faint trace of blood that led them toward the hallway. Every detail seemed to scream of violence, of a struggle that had escalated far beyond control. But what unsettled them most wasn't just the brutality, it was the eerie absence of the one thing that could have provided answers. Her phone. In today's world, a phone is more than just a device. It's a diary, a witness, a record of every thought, fear, and plan. But hers was gone. Not tucked into her purse, not hidden under the bed, vanished. And with it, perhaps, the final messages she sent, the last person she called, the digital breadcrumbs that could have revealed the truth. Detectives knew immediately that this was no ordinary oversight. Someone had taken it. Neighbors were questioned, and while most claimed they had heard nothing unusual, a few admitted to hearing raised voices the night before. One neighbor described it as angry, desperate yelling, but couldn't make out the words. Another said they thought they heard something slam, followed by silence. No one had called the police. No one had knocked on the door to check. The silence of that night hung heavy in the investigation. If someone had acted, even just once, could she have been saved? Detectives began piecing together her final hours, starting with her movements earlier that day. Surveillance cameras from a nearby store showed her running errands, her face calm, but her eyes clouded with something unspoken. She had texted a friend later that evening, a message that now seemed haunting. "I'll explain everything soon." Those would be her last words. As investigators dug into her life, one name kept surfacing: his. Friends spoke of their turbulent relationship, the way he had slowly tightened his grip around her life. Some recalled her fear of leaving him. Others mentioned the threats he had made if she dared to walk away. Each story painted a picture of a man whose charm had decayed into menace. And then, as though fate wanted to strip away his mask, a crucial clue emerged. Surveillance footage from outside the apartment building showed a shadowy figure leaving late that night. The grainy video revealed only fragments: broad shoulders, hurried steps, the faint glint of a phone in hand. But to detectives, it was enough. Whoever that figure was, they had walked out of the building carrying the one object that could explain everything. When they compared the silhouette to photos of him, the similarities were undeniable. But circumstantial evidence was not enough for an arrest. They needed proof, hard proof, that he had been there, that he had silenced her, and that he had taken the very thing that could have told her story in her own words. So they followed him. Quietly, patiently, detectives began tracking his movements, watching his patterns. They pulled his phone records, noting gaps where calls should have been. They checked his bank statements, searching for anomalies. And then came the moment that broke the case wide open. Buried deep in the digital trail was a location ping. His phone had been near her apartment at the exact time neighbors heard shouting. It was the smoking gun they had been waiting for. Combined with the footage, the missing phone, and the testimony of her friends, the picture was becoming clear. Still, there was something chilling about the way he carried on with his life afterward. While investigators pieced together the horror, he went to work, smiled at acquaintances, pretended nothing had happened. To the outside world, he was just another man moving through the motions of daily life. But detectives knew better. They knew they were watching someone who had crossed an irreversible line. The arrest came quietly, in the early hours of the morning. He offered little resistance, but his eyes gave away what his words did not. He knew why they were there. He knew the past had finally caught up to him, but what detectives didn't know yet was how much darker the story would become once the trial began. Because behind closed doors, his version of events twisted reality into something almost unrecognizable, forcing her family to relive their grief in the cruelest way possible. If someone can carry on as if nothing happened after such a brutal act, what does that say about the darkness lurking in ordinary lives? And how many others live among us with secrets no one dares imagine? The trial revealed shocking details no one expected, with testimony that left the entire courtroom stunned into silence. If you're ready to hear what happens next, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. The courtroom was packed on the first day of trial. Every seat was filled, from journalists hunched over notepads to friends and family clutching tissues in trembling hands. The air buzzed with a nervous energy, the kind that always surrounds high-profile cases. Everyone wanted to see the man accused of stealing a life, to measure him with their own eyes, to decide whether he looked like a monster or just another ordinary man. When he walked in, shackled but upright, there was a murmur in the crowd. He looked calm, almost too calm. His eyes scanned the room but avoided the corner where her family sat, clutching one another for strength. It was as if acknowledging them would shatter the mask he wore. The prosecution began with a chilling narrative. They painted the picture of a relationship poisoned by control, of threats whispered behind closed doors, of a woman who had finally begun to find her voice only to be silenced forever. Piece by piece, they laid out the evidence. The surveillance footage of him leaving the building, the missing phone, the digital trail placing him at her apartment. Their words struck like blows, each one hammering the same point home. This was not random. This was not a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. The defense countered with a different story, one that twisted reality into something unrecognizable. They argued that he was too young to fully understand his actions, that he had been provoked, that what happened was not murder but a tragic accident. They emphasized his clean-cut appearance, his polite demeanor, the way he sat quietly beside his lawyers. To the defense, he was not a killer, but a troubled young man who had simply made a mistake. But the most devastating moments came when her loved ones took the stand. One by one, they shared pieces of her life, fragments of the person who had been taken away. Her best friend spoke of her laughter, of the way she always knew how to brighten the darkest days. Her mother spoke through tears, describing the calls that no longer came, the voice she would never hear again. And then there were her colleagues, who remembered her dreams, her plans, her determination to make something of herself despite all the obstacles she faced. The jury listened in silence, some visibly shaken by the raw emotions spilling into the room. These were not abstract facts. These were the shattered lives left in the wake of violence. Then came the turning point. A forensic expert took the stand, holding up a small bag containing the victim's phone, the phone that had disappeared the night she was killed. It had been recovered from a dumpster miles away, traced back through surveillance cameras that showed him disposing of it. On that phone were her final messages, never sent, drafts that spoke of fear, of her need to get away, of the hope that tomorrow would be different. Reading those words aloud in court was like reopening the wound all over again. Gasps echoed through the room, and her mother broke down completely, her sobs filling the silence. It was no longer just theory. This was her voice, her final thoughts, preserved in digital ink. The defense scrambled, insisting that panic had driven him to discard the phone, that it was not proof of intent. But the jury had seen enough. They had heard her voice, seen his shadow leaving the scene, felt the weight of the evidence. And yet, even with the case laid bare, One question lingered. Why? Why had he done it? Was it jealousy? Rejection? A blind outburst of rage? Or something darker, rooted in prejudice and shame? He never offered a clear answer. Sitting silently as testimonies piled against him, he seemed almost detached, as if he were watching someone else's trial. Perhaps in his mind, he had already severed himself from what he had done. Perhaps that was the only way he could survive it. When the closing arguments were delivered, the prosecution's words lingered longest. They spoke not just of a life taken, but of a pattern, a truth society too often ignored. She was not just another statistic. The prosecutor said. She was a daughter, a friend, an artist, a human being, and she deserved to live. The jury withdrew, leaving the room in a tense silence that stretched for hours. Families waited with bated breath, reporters whispered about possible outcomes, and the accused sat motionless, hands folded, eyes fixed on the floor. Finally, the verdict came. The jury filed back into the room, their faces solemn, their voices steady. But what they said next would ripple far beyond those four walls. When a court is forced to choose between a life cut short and a young man who destroyed it, what does justice really mean? Is it punishment, closure, or the delicate balance between the two? The verdict was shocking, but what happened next is even more haunting. If you want to know the outcome and the consequences that have divided the community, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. The jury filed back into the courtroom, 12 men and women carrying the weight of a decision that would change lives forever. The room fell silent. Every breath held as the foreperson stood with the folded slip of paper in hand. Even the air seemed heavy, pressing down on the families waiting on either side of the aisle. Guilty. The word cut through the silence like a blade. Guilty of murder. Her family collapsed into each other's arms, sobbing, clutching the hands they had held tightly throughout the trial. The relief was immediate, but so was the pain, because no matter what the verdict was, she wasn't coming back. Justice had been delivered, but it was an imperfect kind, a judgment that could never match the life that was lost. On the other side of the room, his mother let out a strangled cry, collapsing against her chair. The boy she had raised, the son she had once rocked to sleep, was now branded a killer. His life, too, was over, not in the same way, but still destroyed by the choices he made one night that spiraled into tragedy. The judge's voice carried the sentence, heavy and deliberate. Years behind bars. A life now confined to steel doors and concrete walls. The community that once whispered about what had happened now had its answer. But did it feel like enough? Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as protesters gathered. Some carried signs demanding recognition, insisting this was not just a murder but a hate crime, an attack rooted in prejudice and shame. Others argued back, saying it was simply a crime of passion gone too far. The debate raged, spilling into headlines, opinion columns, and late-night talk shows. Her name was on everyone's lips, but in very different ways. To her family, she was their daughter, gone far too soon. To activists, she became a symbol, another name in a long list of victims whose identities had made them targets. And to skeptics, she was just a tragic story twisted into a political debate. In the middle of all of it, her mother stood on the courthouse steps, clutching a photo of her daughter. Her voice shook as she spoke. She was not just my child. She was a human being who deserved to live. I don't want her remembered as a victim. I want her remembered as who she was. The cameras captured every word, but it was her tears that lingered longest. Grief and strength interwoven, refusing to let her daughter be erased. As for him, he sat in a cold cell, awaiting transfer to prison. The mask of calm he wore during the trial was gone. Now, he was just another young man staring at a future he could no longer control. Did he feel regret? Did he replay that night in his head, wishing he had walked away instead? Or had he convinced himself that the outcome was inevitable, that he was simply a victim of his own impulses? The truth of what went on inside his mind may never be known. What was left were the consequences, and the silence left behind by a life taken too soon. But even with a verdict, even with a sentence, the questions would not stop echoing. What drives a person to such violence? Could someone have intervened before it escalated? And most haunting of all, if society truly valued lives like hers, would she have been safer that night? Can justice ever be complete when the victims' voices have been silenced forever, and the answers we crave remain buried in silence? The trial may be over, but the story is not. What happened over the years has shaken everyone. The aftermath, the shocking revelations, and the scars that never heal. If you want the full story, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next installment. Years passed, but the weight of that night never lifted. For her family, time did not heal in the way people promised. Birthdays came and went without her. An empty chair at the table was a constant reminder of the life stolen. Her mother still kept her daughter's room untouched, as if she might walk through the door again. Sometimes she would sit on the bed and whisper to her, hoping the words would find their way to wherever she was now. The community, too, carried the wound. What had begun as a single tragedy became a point of reflection, a mirror held up to society. People asked themselves, how many more lives would be cut short before something truly changed? Candlelight vigils were held every year in her name. Friends, family, and strangers who had never known her gathered to light candles against the darkness, chanting her name so it would not fade into silence. Activists pushed harder, using her story as both a symbol and a warning. They spoke about the fear many lived with, the constant hiding, the shame that could be weaponized, the danger of being yourself in a world that did not always accept you. Her name joined others on banners, on murals, on lists that were far too long, lists that no one wanted to exist, but which grew every year. And what about him? In prison, the years stretched endlessly. The boy who once walked freely now counted days by the clanging of metal doors. Some said he was remorseful, that he had written letters no one would ever see, trying to explain himself. Others believed he never truly understood the gravity of what he had done, that he saw himself as a victim of circumstance rather than a killer who had made a choice. Whatever the truth, his life was confined to shadows, a stark contrast to the freedom he once took for granted. The families of both victim and perpetrator became unwillingly tied together, forever linked by violence and grief. His mother, who once wept in the courtroom, still struggled to reconcile the son she raised with the man who had taken a life. She, too, lived with whispers in the community, judged, pitied, sometimes even blamed. There were no winners in this story, only survivors trying to find a way forward. But the deepest question remained. Was justice really served? The court had spoken. A sentence had been handed down. But could that ever balance the scale? Could prison years ever equal a lost life, a stolen future, a grieving family? Late at night, her mother would sometimes replay it in her head. The what-ifs. What if she hadn't met him? What if she hadn't trusted him? What if society had made it safer for her to be herself? Those questions had no answers, but they burned all the same. The case became more than just a tragedy. It became a story retold in classrooms, in advocacy meetings, in documentaries like this one. A reminder of what unchecked prejudice, shame, and violence could do. A reminder of the fragility of life, and how quickly it could be taken away. And yet, amid the grief and anger, there was also a determination, a refusal to let her be forgotten. Her name became a vow, spoken by those who promised to keep fighting, to keep telling her story until change came. As we close this story, one thing remains painfully clear. Justice is not a destination. It is a struggle, one carried on by the living, and perhaps the truest justice is not in a courtroom verdict, but in making sure no one else has to share her fate. So, after everything, the loss, the trial, the years that followed, what do you think justice really means? Is it a sentence, or is it something far larger, something society still hasn't fully achieved?